start the recording. All right, Charles. So all yours for Homage to Catalonia by George Orwell.
Well, let me start off by saying, if this book confused you about the Spanish Civil War, join the club. And I have read extensively on the Spanish Civil War. I know how I got hooked on it, but I have followed through and read an awful lot. And what I have realized is that if you try to learn it by the initials or by the various Spaniards that led the government or with this or that, you'll go completely crazy about it. So the first thing I had asked was just like as a survey question, whether you have read other books about the Spanish Civil War, excluding Hemingway's book.
Charles, we don't have to do this, but we found it does seem to get things off people's chests if we let people give a quick overall.
Oh, absolutely. Is
that okay with you? Because
it's perfect with
yeah,
Benny. It's perfect with me. It's no problem. No problem.
Okay, so who wants to start up?
Well, I can say that this is a very, very strong book. I'm an admirer of Orwell, and I think he does a very, very good job with trying to talk about his own experiences and his desire to fight fascism. So it's a marvelous effort, I think.
Okay, I can go next. I thought it was an interesting book. I noticed somewhere George Orwell said he thought it was his best book. I guess he should know, but I don't agree with him. I think Animal Farm and 1984 are a lot more profound than this one was. But I think it brings up some interesting points about civil wars within civil wars. I think it's not, and this maybe goes into some of Charles's questions. I'm not sure it's really a great history of the Spanish Civil War. I think it misses a lot of the nuances and a lot of what was going on in the world, especially between the Soviet Union and Germany. And this was a trial period, almost a practice for World War II in a lot of ways. But I thought it was interesting to see the development of ideas, which I think do come out in some of his later works. And then one other thing that came to mind was whether this was a little bit like the trial in Kafka, when he talks about the guy from Belgium, Kopp, and what happened to him when he was arrested, and this endless process of why is he being arrested and what can you do about it? It's almost like it was taken right out of the trial of why am I here and what are you doing to me and what's going to happen. So an interesting book. I don't think a great book, but I found it very interesting.
I enjoyed it very much. I lived in Spain in the late 70s for a short period as an exchange student, and the Spanish Civil War was very alive in Spain at that time. You could feel it even in like the house where we were living. The family took sides and talked about how the war had affected them, and they really didn't want us American students there, but they needed the money, and everything about the war was still very much alive, and it's still very much alive today in the debates that are going on over the fallen soldier at that giant mausoleum. And so I think it's a very relevant book. I don't think it's ancient history. I think it's very important for understanding today. I was also an exchange student in Peru in the late 70s. And the kind of internal debates within the left were the debates we were having at the university in the social sciences department in Lima, Peru. So, you know, which part of which faction of which Maoist, Stalinist, Trotskyist, anarchist. There were 33 political parties vying for the elections of 1980 in Peru, and our discussions were about Christian democracy, social democracy, all these different factions. So all of that I found very relatable. I also thought his descriptions of looking for food, absolutely mind-blowing. When I think of war, perhaps because of movies, I tend to think of the fighting. I don't tend to think of the deprivation of soldiers waiting to fight or holding the line. And I found that absolutely extraordinary, like that you spend your days looking for, you know, whatever tiny shoot you could find. I just absolutely adored that. And I've recommended the book since to people who have been in the Peruvian left with me and in our university from that time. So I'm very thankful. I really enjoyed it.
Well, I'm going to be a little contrarian. I have to say up front that I think the literary value of the book is just about null for me. It does have, you know, it's a better eyewitness account than many, I'm sure. And so it's of historical interest. I personally found it really only of interest as to how it influenced and led to more mature works, and specifically to 1984. So Charles's question on that, I think, is a really, really important one. But I have to say, I came away, I mean, I remember reading chapter 5 and saying, this is the most confused and confusing chapter I've ever read. And Orwell had the self-awareness to say, I think at a later chapter when he had to talk about the political side, as he called it, saying this may seem trivial. I do kind of think now, you know, over 100 years later, the book is much more about something that I don't think Orwell intended. It's about the sheer folly of man, almost playing at war and revolution. And that it just ends horribly. I found him as a narrator really quite unattractive. I mean, just to give a couple of examples of his coldness, I think this is chapter 2, a bullet getting home on a human body. He later says in chapter 11, I think, sniping at fascists, rather fun. And so I didn't expect this out of George Orwell, that it would be such a cold, inhuman kind of, and again, maybe it's young, it's somewhat adolescent, even though he was no longer physically an adolescent, almost playing at war for various reasons. And so I do think that what came out of this, particularly for his development, and I look forward to Charles and everyone else's greater insight into what happened from 1936 before and on and so on, but that it sounds like he opened his eyes to the extreme danger of propaganda from the communists. He kind of gets into, well, maybe there's some propaganda, maybe it's everywhere. And I recently read a review on completely another subject, but it started with a quote from George Orwell: "All art is propaganda." And so so for me, this book is unintentionally perhaps, but it's all about propaganda and then how that moves into his more mature thinking in 1984. Although I have to say, I think he remained naive in some areas. So that's my overall view, and I look forward to other people's insights.
Well, as I said before, Orwell's book is not a history of the Spanish Civil War, but I don't call him naive. And he understood the power of a bullet because he got shot. And he went there, he went there for the proper motivation. When the Abraham Lincoln, it was actually a battalion, came back, they were scorned in America. And what they defended themselves later on as premature anti-fascists. And I think that Orwell was a premature anti-fascist because he went against Britain in the sense that Britain signed the Non-Intervention Pact, and yet he went. He was not a communist. Some people report he was a communist, but he was a socialist in the British sense. He had already written about the lower classes. He had lived in poverty almost on purpose. So he wasn't naive, and I think he did go for the right reasons. There's an interesting book. Again, I could be tedious about this whole thing, but it's a book called Spain Betrayed: The Soviet Union and the Spanish Civil War. And the basic outlook is very similar to Orwell's view that the Soviets really were not interested in the Republic winning. And their major interest, if the Republic won, was to become part of the Soviet sphere of influence. But you put yourself in the Republic's point, and this was a real failure of democracy. America didn't help. France didn't help. Britain didn't help. Only Russia would help. So it's funny. This is the third time I've read the book, and this was the first book I read on the Spanish Civil War. And so it was like the basis of my knowledge. And now I do understand the war differently, but my appreciation of this as a memoir of what war is about is really actually deeper. And my respect for Orwell going over there was deeper. He was a participant. And he was not a communist. He didn't. Now, I think that he was wrong as to his some of the comments later on about the POUM, because they were very, very radical. They were the ones that burnt the churches and did the things that gave the Republic such a bad reputation, along with the anarchists. At any rate, there's so much in this book that makes me respect Orwell. The fact that it's not a great history doesn't detract from what I think it is really an exceptional memoir.
Let me say a few things here, Charles, if that's okay. The book is very strong for me because a lot about Orwell's life. And I would say not only did he go to Spain to fight the fascists, he also went to Spain because he was a man of action. He rose to the rank of lieutenant. He was almost fearless on the battlefield. At one point in the book, he's watching a train go by and flags flying. He said you could almost believe in the glory of war. So there's something about that, I would say, manly person of action was very much part of Orwell's character and strength. And apparently he was a very good leader of men. The other thing that interests me is Orwell came from a class-bound Great Britain. He was a scholarship boy Cyprians that experience with her children, incredibly snobbish, wounded him. And one of the things that you feel well, I feel when I read this book is that he's free, certainly at the beginning, of all snobbery. People are not using the formal form of address. People are, and he said all of that class consciousness evaporated. And I think that the beginning of the book, and here I would differ with Ben, I think some of the writing is very, very strong. And some of it is Orwell at his best. So he meets this young, I think it's a Spaniard, and he feels an immediate liking for this person. And it's a wonderful way to begin the book because it's a basis of brotherhood, but he makes it very, very specific right at the beginning of the book. Now, I haven't read about the Spanish Civil War at all. I think Homage to Catalonia and the Hemingway book are the only ones, but I'm very, very interested in Orwell's take on things. What Doreen mentioned, the search for food. There's a wonderful section on potatoes and how they have to find potatoes and crawl on their bellies under, sniper fire, and the feel of what it's like to be in the ditches, to be in the trenches is so important. The other thing I would say about Orwell is Orwell loves to take a conventional look at things and contradict it. So it's as if he's saying to us, well, if you think that war is this way, I'll tell you what war is really like. And that he certainly does it. And it's a marvelous stance. He said, you think communism is great? In 1984, he shows you what it is really like. If you think you know what a posh public school is like in Britain, I'll tell you what it's really like. And I always liked that combative part of him, the way he turns the table. And Down and Out in Paris and London, he makes a remarkable statement about what it's like to really be a beggar on the street. And he says it's hard work. And then he shows you how difficult it is. So we have a book that's very, very much Orwell and some wonderful flashes of descriptive writing. He's very, very good at it. And the torturous business, all the factions with their various initials, he goes to great pains to say that POUM is not conspiring with the fascists. That's why he has to spend so much time doing that. So anyway, that's my take on Orwell.
One of the things that you got to give him a lot of credit for, and he says it over and over again. First, he wrote this book while the war was still going on. So anyone who picked it up thinking it should be, and I did the first time I read it, a history of the Spanish Civil War, it really wasn't a history of the Spanish Civil War. It was a history of a little piece of the country, because he was, in the Aragon, around Teruel and Barcelona. And he speaks about where he wanted to be. He wanted to be in Madrid. So I think he's very honest and very brave to write a book that close to the event. And I don't know what the POUM really was. They were not the fifth column, so to speak. That's for sure. But they certainly disagreed with the communists, and they disagreed with the socialists, not so much with the anarchists. But it really doesn't matter. He would have much preferred to fight in a different group. In fact, in the book, he says he really had the most affinity for the anarchists, which came as a surprise to me. I didn't remember it the first two times I read it, but I enjoyed this book more the third time because I had less expectations of what I needed from it. I read it as a current memoir of what he went through, and I think he was very, very honest about this whole thing. He really was. Now, Doreen, it's interesting that you were thinking about how they were scrounging for food, and what struck me was because Barcelona really didn't come under attack until much later, as opposed to Madrid. And what surprised me was he could go into restaurants and expensive restaurants and eat and drink. And they were apparently, if you had money, they were still available during the war. So,
That was when he was in the city, but when
Yeah.
he was out at the front is
oh,
where
no, no,
there
no,
was-
you're absolutely right. I mean, the contrast between the people who were living their life in the city and these young men and women who were dying in the, in the various fronts was remarkable, and even how they distributed the weapons depending upon what your political party was. But I'm glad I read it the third time. There's a book that came out not too long ago, Miriam, and it was kind of a fascinating book by Hitchens, Christopher Hitchens, and it's Why Orwell Matters. And it goes into, just, I think if you ask most people what was Orwell, they would say he was anti-communist. But that he was anti-totalitarian, and it comes through in this book very, very much so. I guess when I say that, it shouldn't surprise me that he identified with the anarchists.
In my book, this is near the beginning of the book, and I kind of had so much sympathy for Orwell. He writes, there was no boss class, no menial class, no beggars, no prostitutes, no lawyers, no priests, no bootlicking, no cap touching. I was breathing the air of equality, and I was simple enough to imagine that it existed all over Spain. He was breathing the air of equality. This is at the very, very beginning. And I think he says somewhere, all wars kind of play themselves out and lose their initial goodness, if you could call it good, And then, the very, very first page, his description
It
of,
says the fact is, this is in chapter 10, page 116.
yeah,
The fact is that every war suffers a kind of progressive degradation with every month that it continues,
right.
because such things as individual liberty and a truthful press are simply not compatible with military efficiency. That's what you referencing now?
Exactly, that's the one I was referring to. And then the beginning, it's not easy to write this kind of thing. It looks so simple. He says, in the Lenin barracks in Barcelona, the day before I joined the militia, I saw an Italian militiaman standing in front of the officers' table. So then he describes, and he has a wonderful, clear, strong Orwellian description. He was a tough-looking youth of 25 or 6 with reddish yellow hair and powerful shoulders. His peaked leather cap was pulled fiercely over one eye. He was standing in profile to me, his chin on his breast, gazing with a puzzled frown at a map which one of the officers had open on the table. Something in his face deeply moved me. It was the face of a man who would commit murder and throw away his life for a friend. The kind of face you would expect in an anarchist. Of course, he's reading into it, but who knows? Though as likely as not, he was a communist. And then he talks about the candor and ferocity in it. And he said, obviously, he could not make head or tail of the map. Obviously, he regarded map reading as a stupendous intellectual feat. I hardly know why, but I have seldom seen anyone, any man, to whom I have taken such an immediate liking. So here what you can say. I guess you could say it's his man-to-man connection. He doesn't use a word like brotherhood, but it's that human connection that he makes. And it has nothing to do with snobbery.
But Miriam, if I can add, it looks to me like it's complete fantasy from a young Orwell. And why? Because
Yeah, that's true.
I'm glad you brought this up. So he created his own utopia, and he runs with this utopia for most of the book until he gets a little bit disillusioned. But in the next paragraph, after really talking about his crush on this young Italian, he goes, but I also knew that to remain my first impression of him, I must not see him again. And needless to say, I never did see him again.
And well, see, I think
go
ahead.
One was always making contacts of that kind in Spain. Now, my view on this book is that it's a travel book gone awry. Okay, because he didn't actually tell us how he got there. He disses his wife. What a cold husband he sounds like. I mean, she pops up and he never, the only nice thing he says about her really is that she sympathized with his desire to never leave Spain. So that's how crazy she was along with him. But beyond that, we had no idea who this wife was. Now, maybe this is the empirical British travel style where you can't talk, I don't know, you can't talk about yourself, but his wife is completely, downtrodden in this account, and he's doing this all on first impressions, and he likes it that way. So he has strong first impressions, I'll grant him that, and he has to go a little bit deeper in terms of the completely bizarre internecine politics.
Well, I understand you wanted more. You wanted more about her name is Eileen Shaughnessy. They were very deeply connected. She died young, unfortunately. In any case, it's not about
She's a nullity of a character. She has no personality in this book at all. So
oh no, that's true. I can understand you wanting more in the third dimension, but I would also point out that Orwell says, it was a good thing that I didn't see him again. It's almost his awareness that his idealization of this young man would be in danger if he were to see him again. So there's a kind of, certainly an awareness of that.
Because he's living on a naive political illusion or fantasy, and that keeps him going throughout the whole book.
Do you think that idealists or people that want something that has not been achieved yet are naive?
Gee, I don't know. I see this really very, very differently.
Okay.
And part of it comes from another book I read, which is called Orwell and Churchill. And it goes into a great description of down and out in the 1930s and what the background of the people, intellectual type people in the 1930s was. And it sort of summarizes, it says that the poet Stephen Spencer put it this way. He said, the general feeling emerging was that this generation might well see the end of Western civilization. And that they truly felt that. And they felt that capitalism was tired and dying, and that there were really two choices in the world, fascism and social and communism. And then it also goes into the Orwell's experiences in Pakistan, which was before Spain. So this was not like his first rodeo sort of thing. He was a journalist, he was an adventurer, and he went to Spain as a journalist, not to join the army. And he joined the POUM after he got into Spain as a journalist. And it gives a description here of the POUM, and it says basically it was just a group of lunatics, and they really had, and he pretty much points this out. They didn't have any arms. basically. They didn't have the logistics to feed their people. They just wanted to sort of destroy everything. And he didn't even want to be with them at the end of the day. He really wanted to be with a more organized group so he could go to Madrid and fight a real war, which he never fought. So I think, to me, the interesting part of the book, the observations, yes. Having worked with US Transcom for an awful long time, the logistics of trying to feed people during a war, yes. The part about the formulation of what his real ideas were and his ambivalence. I think not only do you see, as he's going through this, talking about the bad things about totalitarianism, but in the 1984, but I think you also see Animal Farm as you see people changing the posters on the walls as to what it is they were fighting for this week. And it's like 2 feet good or 4 feet good, 2 feet better, and with changing the slogans on the barn. And I think you see a lot of that coming out in this. Plus the adventurism, and I'm not sure I see anything particularly noble about what he was doing. I think he was wading into a situation, trying to learn from it, being a little bit of an adventurist, and going, okay, and I'll go up to the front and I'll fight a war where really in his part of the war, it wasn't much of a war at all. So again, I think it's a really interesting book, but I don't think we ought to glorify him on this one.
I'm going to go on a different way. Maybe I think Doreen might agree with me somewhat. The man went and fought a war against fascism. To call him an adventurer, yes, he did. It's what he did fight a war against fascism. I'm looking at you shaking your head. I don't know what. But
that's not what he says in the introduction of the book, but okay.
I didn't see the introduction. Trilling wrote the introduction to my book, but he did fight fascism. And he certainly said that as between the two, well, let's put it this way. Most people who went to Spain in the International Brigade went there to fight fascism, whether they were communists, socialists. About 25% of the International Brigade or 30% were Jews. So they were clearly fighting fascism. So I've always thought of Orwell as an anti-fascist. Whether he got on the boat thinking he was going to fight or not, it's disputed. It really is. I've read different accounts. Whether he went as a socialist or a communist, it's disputed. But he clearly had a side. He didn't go there as a travel writer. He didn't go there. He was much more involved with the war than, say, a Hemingway.
Oh, yeah.
He was much more in line with John Dos Passos, and the famous break that John Dos Passos had with Hemingway was exactly over this issue. It was a man called Gil Robles. Why was he killed? And Hemingway would never believe he was killed because the communists wanted him dead. But I think Orwell went over there with a certain political view and a certain idealism, and to call him just merely either a mercenary or a soldier or an adventurer or a travel writer really demeans his purpose. I respected what he did. That was a paid political announcement brought to you by the Citron Political Party.
Charles, I'd like to agree. You said something earlier that I thought was quite true. And again, seeing this book and
Hi, Mark.
Hey, Mark, and how it reflects and develops into 1984. 1984 isn't about communism. It's about totalitarianism.
Right.
I think we all can agree totalitarianism is fascist and communist.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Okay, so it's so in and to not make too fine a point of it, the Nazi name was National Socialist as opposed to International Socialists of the Soviet Union, and so you can really think the whole book, even though he doesn't realize it, is about internecine, and he's afraid that it seems trivial, the infighting on the totalitarian side.
I'm sorry, communism is not the same as socialism, is not the same as social democracy, is not the same as anarchism. So if you're saying that the Republic was all communist, it clearly wasn't. That was his main point. That there was a coalition of many different forces, including bourgeois forces that were capitalist, there were Democrats, there were social democrats, there were Christian Democrats. It's not all communist. That was the main point. It was usurped by the communists, and that was the downfall of it, from how I understood his analysis.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying
Okay, good.
that total government control is at one side of the spectrum, and actually anarchy is at the other. But in this case, the anarchic party is really kind of on, anyway, I won't go into that. That's the outlier. Every other part of this war is about total government power. And so they're
Where?
all, the communists, the POUM, remember, M is Marxist. It was known as the Lenin Division before it was called POUM. They were maligned as the Trotskyist party, because again, as we know, on the left, the closer you are, why Stalin hated, or why Lenin hated Trotsky, is that it's too close. It's like it was competition. And so we see this huge difference in this. No difference. They're just infighting among hard left.
No, but Ben, what Doreen was saying was in the election of 1936, which brought in what was basically a popular front, similar to what they had in France. The
Okay, I
communists.
just figured out how to put the Zoom on mute. I'm on my book club. I will do the grill now.
So what are we having for dinner, Mark? What are we having for dinner? So in 1936, the Communist Party was a minor part of the left. They only became important because they were the only ones, Mexico a little bit, that would sell arms to the Republic, which, by the way, they sold. They took all of the gold reserves of Spain. And since they controlled the arms, they basically had a much stronger position in the government at the end. But in the beginning, as Doreen pointed out, there were non-socialists, there were quote liberals, there were people that wanted reform, but certainly were not pleased when the revolution broke out, when the revolt broke out by the nationalists, that churches were being burned and all of that. I mean, that was a reaction which really centered mostly in various parts of Spain. But at any rate, to say that this was a war between two equally totalitarian forces is not historically correct. It really isn't.
I took the opportunity to reread 1984. So I really appreciate the incentive that reading this early Orwell book gave. He romanticizes revolution. He sounds to me like he's completely in for burning down churches, because that's part of, I guess, the kind of English class system thoughts that he has to destroy come hell or high water. But in 1984, he does seem to have matured somewhat. So he's not romanticizing revolution any longer. And he puts into the mouth of the words of O'Brien, who's the mouthpiece of the party, who's torturing Winston Smith for the last third or quarter of the book. And O'Brien says, one does not establish a dictatorship in order to safeguard a revolution. One makes the revolution in order to establish the dictatorship. So I have to believe he actually matured some, because while in this book, Homage to Catalonia, he's romanticizing revolution left and right. You know?
No,
You have to remember that the church backed the fascists.
Okay,
And that
a burning church is
Franco
yeah,
was,
but that was a minor. That was not that was not the government position, and it was a terrible thing that they did. It was a terrible thing. But if you read the description by the U.S. ambassador, the guy by the name of Bowers, and and he was transferred immediately after Franco came into power. He said that it was greatly exaggerated, the burning of churches, and it was a bad idea to burn churches. It was a bad idea to do a lot of different things, but they didn't revolt. There was the elected government in Spain was the Republic. The nationalists are the ones who revolted. And what's ironic is they revolted, and their major force were non-Spaniards in the very beginning of their revolt. Their civil war that they began. They were bringing over Moors from Africa on German transports. So it's a shame what happened there, but I don't think you can equate in the same way. How can you, if you think about it, in 1941, we became allies with the same communists. Does that make the United States a totalitarian country in 1941?
No, so my point, I think, remains. He romanticized revolution. You know, he argues between whether Poom is better than the full communists who he believes are state capitalists, and that they've kind of betrayed the cause, kind of thing, and then the anarchists or this and that. He romanticizes revolution because he still has an adolescent revolutionary fervor.
I completely disagree with you. I completely disagree.
But he
How
does
can you how can you romanticize revolution?
That he speaks very well of revolution throughout this book, except when he gets disillusioned that they're all fighting among each other.
I'm empathetic to that view. So why do you disagree so much, Doreen?
I don't think he's romanticizing revolution. He's putting his life on the line. He can't even eat. He's going through the mud. He's wearing disgusting clothes for the sake of a different kind of society, for a different kind of society where there's more equality, where there's not fascism, where there's more of a democracy among the people that you call revolution, that he was talking about equality. He was talking about being on the side of the worker. And I don't think he was romanticizing it because he was living it. He was putting his life on the line, something many people don't.
By the book's end, he says specifically he hopes that the Franco dictatorship will be, softer than its forms in other countries, but that the choice is either that dictatorship or I forget which party, but he said his gang was heading towards dictatorship too. So he was, dictatorship was what this, was the path that everything was going in. And he was a little bit disappointed and disillusioned by book's end, but only luckily, when he got around to 1984, he renounced that somewhat adolescent romanticizing of revolution.
How did you see it, Mark?
I wanted to, I don't know whether you can see this. This is George Orwell in uniform in Burma.
Yes.
he's the tallest man there.
And then after that, here is George Orwell in uniform in the Home Guard in Britain. George Orwell enjoyed being in uniforms. Now,
No, did you ever read?
Wait, let me finish. There's some people.
I'm sorry, Jay.
There are some people who enjoy being in uniforms, and I think he was one of them. And not understand, he went to Spain first to report on it, and then goes, yes, I think I'll join one of the groups. And then he joined the group that he didn't even agree with. That doesn't make him this great idealist. I agree that I think he had a socialist trend, which was understandable. I think he was living in an era where there was a real conflict about, is capitalism dead? Not terribly different than what we're living through right now. And what is going to replace that? And I think certainly he was embroiled in that, and he was trying to resolve it in his own mind, which he later wrote more about. But I think we're giving Orwell perhaps a little bit more credit than he deserves as a great philosopher and sufferer, when he was. There are some people who simply like to be in uniform and like to be in the military and are willing to run that risk. And thank goodness for them. And I think
Jay?
he
Yeah,
perhaps
sure.
was
Miriam,
one.
you're on mute.
Let me say this. Orwell served as a policeman in Burma.
Thank
He
you.
hated it.
Shooting the elephant.
Exactly. He hated it. And he left after 5 years, despising it and hating
After
it.
5 years.
Yeah,
He
right.
was
Father was in the civil service. That
he was born in
was-
India.
He was
Excuse me, I'm
born
sorry,
in
during.
India, and he had to earn a living. He didn't go on to college. He had to earn a living. And he finally got out of it. And read Shooting an Elephant for a view. I just would not dismiss him as a man who liked to be in uniform. I would say about him that he was a man of action, and he was shot through the neck, almost died, died young of tuberculosis, was a tremendous worker and producer of, of one book after another, and a very interesting and compelling figure. And he despised the totalitarian, he despised fascism, despised that, and he was always, in one way or another, looking for the truth. So, anyway, that's my word on Orwell.
Good gezucht.
What was
So,
your take on it, Mark? Because we didn't hear from you.
right.
Yeah, what?
So apologies for being late. My wife is leaving Maine in the morning and going back to Florida. So I am just squeezing in a little visit with you guys. And it's also been I read this mistakenly, thinking it was the book for earlier this summer. So it's been a while since I read it. But I did read 1984 long ago, and I read some of his nonfiction essays, and so I think I kind of lean to the idea that he is a bit of a romanticist. I think he's a romantic adventurer, and he was really got high on the, putting himself out there at the extremes of life and society and seeing what they're about. And he was an adventurer. He's in the spirit of, other, conquering adventurers. That's romantic to me. And so I think that there's definitely a spirit of romanticism that infused his, decision to be there and to go out into that field of battle. And maybe the motives were a little mixed or confused, or maybe it was more about just the romanticism of, of war. So
Is that necessarily bad?
I don't think it's bad. I think because he tempers that with, he's not a naive romantic. He's not a ideological romantic. He's just a romantic who is also a good journalist and is able to capture, some of the rosy sheen of romanticism comes through in places, but he's also able to, make it clear that that's in the context of a gritty realism. that's always around. So I think he's kind of polishing off the romantic aspects of the grittiest subjects, including war. But that's, you know, I don't think I'm as expert as some of you on this call about Orwell, although I am interested and I want to read more of him.
I think that my opinion that when I first started that maybe this was a bad book for the group has changed dramatically. Anything that could split us with this, I view it as 3-3 at this moment. And, you know, I don't think we're ever going to quite understand exactly who Orwell was, but despite the tragedies involved with his romanticism, his adventure, his idealism, whatever it was, I would like to think in 1936 that I would have been on one of those boats. And when I got there, I would have had no doubt which side I was going to fight on. And, you know, it may have wound up with two evils, but the lesser of the two evil, just as we fought on the same side as the Russians in World War II. They were our brothers in World War II. And if I had gone over there and been in the international brigades, I would have noticed that most of my colleagues, or many of my colleagues, were communists. Many of them were Jews and communists, but some of them were Jews who just wanted to fight the Nazis. Some of them were non-Jews that wanted to fight the Nazis. And there probably were a few, you know, adventurers. I recommend to you the songs of the Spanish Civil War that Pete Seeger put together. They're fascinating when he discusses the various countries that went and the different groups that went in the songs themselves. So I'm happy I picked out this book, and I'm glad that it charged our emotions a bit. Certainly better than, you know, certainly more than some of the other books.
Charles, if I can comment and thank you on chapter 10, which you refer to in a
Yeah, nobody asked any of the questions, which is cool.
No, we've covered a fair
I'm teasing with you.
But chapter 10 is a really important one, and along with chapter 5, because it's the political side, complete confusion. But he ends the chapter by admitting that inter-party polemics is a cesspool, and that's the book is so confused. Even if I grant you all that, let's say fascists are at the other end of the spectrum, which is the conventional way to look at it, I personally look at them all on the same side of the spectrum. That is total government control. He's saying that, you know, the whole book, his whole experience ended in this massive disillusion that essentially they're all killing and torturing each other. Right?
However, what about page 163, where he says, curiously enough, the whole experience has left me with not less, but more belief in the decency of human beings.
Because he wrote it immediately afterwards, and so his mind was still filled with mush and fantasy. By the time
I wouldn't go that far, Ben. I think he's a romantic adventurer in my view, but he's solidly on the side of the down and out, the working class, the underdog, the little guy against the unfair forces. You know, I mean, he's got a political philosophy underlying it all.
But he wrote this book quickly, we know, after. So it's you know, it came out within a year of or two of his experience. You know, in the one that I read, they actually mentioned a lot of the footnotes were errata on his going back and correcting some stuff. So he's in trying to combat the amount of propaganda. And remember, he said 9/10 of the journalism when he was in Spain was untruthful, right? So it's just filled with lies. And so he felt this urgency to try to get the truth out, but his filter is badly damaged, I would say, by his fantasy, utopianism, his romanticism. If I were him, I would have put a errata and before his death removed the book because it confuses, I believe, and that he speaks much more clearly and maturely in 1984, which I highly recommend rereading. It's very appropriate to our times.
You know, I'm going to close my comments by saying what's fascinating about this war is how much it's held the interest of people for all of these years. And, you know, and poets like Auden and Spender, and so many of them have written about the Spanish Civil War. But what's also fascinating is when you win a war, you don't have to write about it, because I really have searched for good books from the nationalist point of view, and they're not easy to find. The history from the nationalist point of view, from the fascist side, from Franco's side, they are not easy to find. One of the erratas that you could put in there is, and maybe he was a little bit romantic about this, he thought that Franco was going to be less vindictive than maybe a Hitler or a Mussolini would be. That was not the case. Franco killed tens of thousands. He sent many more to work camps. In fact, the great memorial that was built where Franco is buried was built by prisoners of war. So he did make a mistake there. Franco was worse than he imagined. Franco was worse than he imagined.
But I agree with Miriam that this idea of seeking the truth is like so important. All of us want to find the truth. We don't want to have it, you know, because of ideology or because of faith. We want to find what the truth. I want to find what the truth is. I can't say all of us. I want to find the truth, and I find it noble that people are seeking the truth. And I find him incredibly honest. He said, you know, I'm trying to not be a partisan. I'm trying to see this as objectively as possible, and forgive me because I'm part of something that sometimes I may not have seen it right. And he was honest enough to move those political parts to a different part of the book at a later stage when he realized some of his observations were not, because he was so involved, shouldn't be in the beginning part of the book. And I admire that so much about him. He was seeking the truth in action. He was seeking the truth in his writing. He was seeking the truth in trying to live the life of the downtrodden, of being with them in the trenches. And that's more than I can say for a lot of people.
And I think Orwell is incredibly positive and a massive writer for exposing the extreme evil of propaganda. And to do that, you have to pursue truth. So he tried to pursue truth. I'm just saying this was a really young book, in my view, confused, inhuman on many levels. The way his narrator, his personality views the war, recounts things about his wife, which is about nothing. He romanticizes sniping at fascists. So the guy shows a really cold, because of his utopic dreams, he shows this really inhuman coldness. He seems to be in favor of burning lots of churches. He has no problem with that. But thank God he matured beyond this book. So I really admire the man, and his search for truth ended up with some incredible works for it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think probably like with everybody else's life, and his is more magnified because of the importance of what he wrote. But there are lots of conflicting things within his life. As Miriam pointed out, he didn't particularly like being a policeman in Burma, but he was for 5 years. Took him a while to come to the resolution he didn't want to do that. He was very much against propaganda, but he spent like 2 or 3 years of his life writing propaganda for the BBC. um,
And he said that all art is propaganda, so he's even admitting.
yeah. So he as he's working through all of this, and I think that's the magic of Orwell, that he worked through his life to come up with 1984 and Animal Farm. That it's not something that was just born from immaculate conception. It was something that he had to go through. And I think part of the Spanish Civil War was part of that experience of learning why totalitarianism, no matter whose side it was on, was the wrong thing and didn't work. What propaganda, what the impact of propaganda was, what the danger of communist propaganda, and the intent that they weren't
No, I'm just
necessarily there
turning
to
it on mute.
overthrow a government at all.
It's just about done. Everything is done here. So
You were holding a plate, so I opened the.
yeah. Oh, is that what you were doing? I was afraid of the sound. Do you want me to bring it in, or are we going to go down this fire pit, or what would you like to do?
No, we'll leave it here.
Okay.
What are we having for dinner? That's what I want to know. I mean, we're not
Right.
invited, right? It
You
hurts.
talking?
Hey, listen, let's not put George Orwell on trial. I mean, I feel like
Thank you.
we've got George Orwell on trial. He did point out in the book that, that we're discussing, that it was the communists who did not, support the fighters and withheld arms and really were responsible for the victory of the fascists. And that to me was very, very interesting indeed.
Well, Miriam, I think who was responsible for the victory of the fascists were the democracies. Had they supplied the republic would have never gone to be as radical as it had to be to survive as long as it did.
That's a very good point, Charles. We've raised some really important questions here. When is revolution, and is revolution ever the way to go? Is revolution ever justified? It's a big, big question, isn't it?
Well, and I think it's underlined when you look at what was going on in Spain. I don't think we should glorify the Republic as a great democracy. It was one.
Yes, I am still on.
So, well, any other thoughts or comments?
Well, I think it's been a wonderful discussion, raised lots of questions. I think whenever you act, you open yourself up to crossing the line, don't you? If you sit in your room and you do nothing, then your actions are never open to question. As soon as you act, then those very, very actions are open to question. So when do you act? When don't you act? He chose to act. He was a man of action. I don't blame him for that.
And
When do you fight? Do you fight? When you fight, do you become necessarily corrupt? And then we have the whole question of, the way of Gandhi and Martin Luther King, which was nonviolence as a way of revolt.
But Gandhi wouldn't have worked in Spain any
No.
more than he would have worked in Germany. And both Orwell and Martin Buber point that out to Gandhi, actually.
Yeah. So these are really big, big questions.
And Miriam, I have to just add that when you act when you're young and don't get killed in the process, thank God there's the chance of maturing.
He was over 30 years old, and he had already written.
I know, but it seems
He was a policeman.
I agree, but it sounds like a very young 33 to me from his behavior.
He felt that the role of being the policeman corrupted him. And he was forced to commit actions that he felt were wrong. So
And
it's,
stupid.
yeah, that's a brilliant, it's a fabulous essay, Shooting an Elephant. It's just wonderful.
But
And
remember, he said sniping fascists is a lot of fun.
don't you think there's some irony there? Isn't there some irony? I don't know.
I'm afraid not, because that was not a solitary kind of quote on his saying. The other one I mentioned is the bullet getting home on human body. And actually in chapter 2, he comments the fascists are actually indistinguishable from ourselves.
Mm.
Ben, nobody's arguing that Orwell is Mother Teresa, or, you know. He was in the middle of a war. People were shooting at him.
Yeah.
I've never had that thrust upon me, but I suspect that killing your enemy, if it's, you know, who is shooting at you, it's not a terrible tragedy. You know, you have to get a little hardened to it, or else you're not going to be very good at war.
Yeah. Well, I expect a little more from a writer.
I think he captured the absurdity of war very well in places. So I don't think he's as immature as you're saying, Ben. Even if his political philosophy evolved, he did he takes you to really interesting places, and he makes you understand what it's like to be there. It's great reportage. I mean, he pioneered this blend of journalism and I don't want to say fiction, but I guess you called it memoir. That's pretty it's pretty sophisticated stuff, even if you disagree with some of the conclusions.
Well, I'm glad that they led to really much better conclusions later.
Yeah.
All right, guys, I gotta go. I'm sorry to be such a peripheral figure tonight, and I'll see you at the next one.
And that's going to be
Okay.
with Miriam on Little Virtues. So it's only 3 weeks away, but it's also a short book, 110 pages. So Mark, thanks for joining us. If quickly, bon voyage for your wife.
Yes.
And Charles, thank you tremendously for suggesting this book and taking on the moderation. So much
Nice
so
job.
excellent questions and much appreciated.
It was good to connect.
Really
Thank you,
well.
everyone.
Be well.
Be
Be
well.
well.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you. Thanks all.
Be well.